Team, welcome back. We're so happy to be back on the Selling Well podcast. And thank you very much for your great words of encouragement. While we took a little bit of an extended vacation here in the summer, we did take a trip to Italy and eat way too much pizza and pasta, Donna and I. But we're back at it now and so excited. We've got some wonderful podcasts coming your way as we lead up to the end of Q4 here. And none better, by the way, than the one that's coming at you right now. Fantastic conversation with Bernadette McClelland. And Bernadette's with Three Red Funnels. That's her consulting company. And she's written just a wonderful book called Shift and Disrupt, Stop Selling Widgets, Start Selling Wisdom. Now, this is Bernadette's sixth book, and she's really had some great testimonials in her books. People like Jeb Blunt and Tony Robbins have provided testimonials for her book, really big names. And this is a fantastic book. I really enjoyed this, where the core concept we get into today is talking about story selling. And that's opposed to storytelling. We've had, as you know, a number of guests on the show talking about storytelling, which for the most part takes us through the hero's journey. Bernadette differentiates with story selling, the model she came up with, and she did it to actually address three key issues a lot of sales leaders and salespeople face. One, when they're going to market. One, finding that right level of connection with a buyer. Number two, having the right depth of conversation with that buyer. And then number three, increasing that rate of conversion as we work through these sales cycles to get to closure. So these are three challenges most sales leaders and salespeople face. And the root cause that Bernadette's come up with for these challenges are really the stories involved, whether these are the stories we tell ourselves as salespeople, whether the stories we tell the buyer, or the stories we elicit from the buyer. And some of the principles of great story selling that Bernadette comes up with and we discuss in today's podcast, there's really 6 of them. Story selling inspires change. It's root cause focused. It's strategy and pictures. It helps to de-risk decisions for the buyer. It increases collaboration and generates wisdom and meaning. It's a great conversation with Bernadette today, folks. One of her other books, by the way, is called When You're Going Through Hell, Keep Going. What a title. By the way, some good advice. I really enjoyed speaking with Bernadette today, team. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this podcast. And when you do, please continue to like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast and tell your friends, because that really matters to us. And thank you for doing so. Here's Bernadette McClelland. Hey, Bernadette, thanks so much for joining the Selling Well podcast. It's so great to meet you.
Same here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So today, by the way, really enjoyed, I haven't completed the whole book, but really enjoyed Shift and Disrupt. Stop selling widgets, start selling wisdom.
Yeah.
Impossible for that to be a bad idea. So we're really gonna unpack what story selling means today, and love your approach here. But Bernadette, maybe to start, let's talk a little bit about your journey in professional sales. Kind of the short story of how'd you get here today?
How did I get here today? Well, it's been a journey, hasn't it? I mean,
It always has. It always is.
Journey with lots of turnbacks and dead ends and freeways where you just go for it. Yeah, I'm really fortunate. I was granted immediate residency a year ago, nearly 18 months ago, actually, to live in the United States. And so my journey, and the reason I'm sharing that is because the way that I came over was based on immigration and the US government recognizing the fact that I am an alien. I've always been like an alien, but an alien of exceptional ability in sales leadership.
Okay.
And so that means a lot to me, because when I first wanted to go into sales in corporate Australia, I was a sales coordinator, and I was doing all the commissions and doing all the orders for the sales guys and back in the 80s. And it was like, oh my God, he's earning that much. And so I applied, but they kept knocking me back. They were by saying that I wasn't aggressive enough. I didn't have what it took to be in sales, and I was too nice. So I kind of hope that I've dialed back the aggressive part that did come out that enabled me to get the job. And so my journey over the years has taken me from corporate Australia through small business in Australia, running, owning a family business, a wholesale, retail, and importing business.
Yes.
And then coming full circle back to running my own consultancy. And of course, that's been a journey.
Well, and as we'll see in the show notes, folks can learn lots more about that consultancy and your keynote speaking. You've got some wonderful testimonials from some of the biggest names in the industry, like Jeb Blunt and Tony Robbins.
Yeah.
So folks will certainly check out that as we move forward. But what an interesting piece of feedback back to the 80s, where somebody would actually get, coaching that you're too nice to be in sales and not aggressive enough. And maybe today we wonder why there's this 50-year-old stereotype about a professional salesperson. That's completely wrong. And the reason we know, of course it's wrong. Those of us who know anything about sales know that stereotype is inaccurate. And in fact, it was the impetus for Dan Pink. You quote Dan Pink multiple times in Shift and Disrupt, but he wrote To Sell is Human because he saw such a gap between that stereotype of professional sales and what he saw when he was interacting with his own personal contacts in professional sales, who were intellectually curious, great at problem solving, creative. We had him on the show a little while back, and at the end, I asked him why he wrote the book, and that's what he told me. He said there was such a gap between the stereotype that didn't apply and where we are today. But you've taken on, this is your fourth book, if I'm not mistaken. Sixth, pardon me. Okay. So I'm going to look at my pretend research person and blame them, but there is no pretend research person. It's me. So I had down, today we're talking about Shift and Disrupt. Prior to that, The Art of Commercial Conversations. The first sale is always to yourself. 25 Ways Not to Lose Your Next Sale. What are the two other books?
When you're going through hell, keep on going.
Nice. There's good coaching.
And Smash Through Your Sales Barrier was my very first book.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. And I may get the book wrong, Bernadette, but I appreciated the authenticity of your story, where after writing, I think it was 25 Ways Not to Lose Your Next Sale. I think it was Matt Church who asked you and said, "Hey, does this book inspire you?" And you said, "No."
Yeah, that was. I was doing a lot of work with Matt Church. He's the founder of Thought Leaders Global out of Sydney, and a wonderful, wonderful community. And he did. I worked with him. I had written the book was actually The First Sale Is Always to Yourself. And so it was my first attempt really at moving my writing into more a thought leadership style, bringing in my own IP, mental models, and all of that. And so and Matt did. He said to me, "Bernadette, did it inspire you?" And hand on heart, it didn't. And I think what I was doing there, just in my growth and in my experimentation, I guess, with writing and thinking. And bringing wisdom, some form of wisdom into my writing, it was probably a little bit too much left brain. And that's okay. And that's okay. So to inspire, for ourselves to be inspired, there has to be a spark of something. Yes. And so Shift and Disrupt, I believe, has brought together the real, rational thinking, which you mentioned. It was like there's research in there, but there's also story. And there's also that inspirational component, because I believe that, not only us as sales professionals, but our buyers need that combination as well. And when we think about the fact that, our oldest form of communication is story, and our oldest form of commerce is selling, it just made sense to bring the two together, create this portmanteau, and really lean into story selling as a concept, as a philosophy, not a methodology, but as a philosophy. And I did a little bit of research before I kind of created my model, and everywhere I looked, we hear story selling, but it's usually about marketing or presentation skills or brand management, or it's bringing in the hero's journey.
Right.
And I didn't want to, I wanted it to be different, and I wanted it to be practical. There's some wonderful experts out there in the storytelling space.
Yes.
And so I wanted to recognize them as well, but I also wanted to bring in a flavor that took a salesperson's or sales professionals' conversations to not just a higher level, but a deeper level, because that's what our buyers are wanting today.
Well, it's an interesting delineation. So we've had a number of guests on the show about storytelling, and probably one of the more popular books out there is Story Brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which always speaks of the hero's journey. It actually makes that reference and says, what you're doing with your storytelling. Yeah, you're making the buyer the hero of the journey, but you've got to go through that process. But from the book, when you're trying to differentiate or delineate between storytelling and story selling, we'll get to in a second. But you actually say story selling is a philosophy that helps a business, its leadership, and its sales team shift how they think and feel about achieving their business outcomes and revenue goals, while ethically supporting the buyer. It helps them see the gaps they didn't know existed and find puzzle pieces they never knew they were missing. So the approach you're taking here is, hey, by going at it this way, taking a little bit of a different approach, not only am I helping the buyer, which we're going to get to in a second, but I'm actually helping my team. And in doing so as a leader, that means I'm helping myself. Tell me a little bit about how else we differentiate storytelling from story selling.
So to begin with, it is based on a model, and it's based on the story, what I refer to as the story selling circles. So to keep it really simple, what I'd like to start with is the concept that growth sits at the center of a Venn diagram. So we're just going to imagine that there's a Venn diagram. So growth sits at the center, and it doesn't matter if it's for our buyer. We want to help our buyer and their business grow. And so we also want our own business to grow as well. So growth is the center. And then we think, well, okay, what are the three key challenges that a sales leader faces with their sales team, or a salesperson faces in going to market? And so those three challenges typically are the right level of connection to start with. And so if we think about, a salesperson's role is to go out there and to approach the decision maker. So there's this right level of connection. And then once that happens, it's like, well, what's the depth of conversation? How can we stop playing in the shallows, and how can we take our conversations deeper?
Yes.
And so we've got connection is a challenge, and the depth of conversation is a challenge, and then the rate of acceleration of the pipeline conversion is a challenge. So they are the three challenges that I believe a sales leader faces with their team, and also a salesperson faces in going to market. Now, the root cause, if you like, of those challenges is found at the intersections. And so this is where story selling comes into play, because when we look at the root cause of the challenges, what's stopping connection, conversations, and conversions is typically 3 stories. And those 3 stories are the stories that the salesperson tells themselves about the buyer or the deal or the comp plan or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
The stories that the internal stories that the salesperson tells themselves about the buyer. It's the external stories, the stories the salesperson tells their buyer. And finally, it's the essential stories. They are the stories the salesperson must elicit from the buyer. And so we've got the goal, the outcome is growth. We've got the 3 challenges of connection, conversation, and conversion. We've got the 3 root causes. And then what I've done in the book is I've built it out even more. And I've looked at those 3 root causes and said, okay, so what needs to happen for that salesperson to strengthen their internal stories to elevate their connection? What needs to happen for that salesperson to tell the right stories, collaborate with the buyer, and deepen their conversations? And what needs to happen for that salesperson to actually elicit the right stories so that they can accelerate their rate of conversion? And they are the 9 story modes, and they are basically the core of Shift and Disrupt.
So fantastic. Thank you. Let's unpack a little bit of this. As I'm playing along, and the folks at home will, when they buy this book, well, we take a look at, what you identified as that beta blueprint. So I know you had a background in neuro-linguistic programming, and you were actually a coach for Tony Robbins at one point in time for a certain region of the world. And he's very big on this as well. But let's talk about those first stories, these stories that the salesperson tells themselves about the buyer.
Yeah, so there's 3, and you're right. I have, I've got every piece of conceivable paper known to mankind and womankind or whatever.
And by the way, they're not on your office behind you there. I thought I'd have all these.
No one's ever asked to see a copy.
Yeah, we're going to have to do fact checking on that after the fact. We've got a team who does that. Same people who do research.
Yeah, and you did say that we're not theorists, we are practitioners. And so this is the whole thing. But, I think, and I look back over my sales journey as well, and I think the realization hit me once I started to dig a little deeper and take my learning to a level that was based on personal leadership. And so, I bring together personal leadership, I've mentioned thought leadership, and sales leadership. So I bring those 3, attributes together. The personal leadership component of it, yes, I never drank the Kool-Aid, I will say that. But I was fortunate enough to have been given that opportunity to not just deepen my practical understanding by working with leaders around the world through that vehicle of coaching, but I also spent 18 months doing a diploma in all things coaching. So executive coaching, sales coaching, business coaching. So that was in Australia, and I did that separately. And that was where the realization came in around being able to tap into communication at a deeper level and really marry in psychology. And that's why I call, the story selling circles, I kind of shift and disrupt. The whole philosophy is pretty much based on 5 disciplines. And so I'm bringing in, it's like a Swiss Army knife. So I'm bringing in disciplines of definitely story as a component, very much mental models. So we'll talk about that later, but psychology, neurolinguistics, and what I refer to as a coach approach. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really big on the fact that salespeople, when they can go to market and be able to coach their buyers rather than sell them. Right. I mean, ultimately, we're there to make a sale, but the vehicle to do it can shift. And so the three stories that fit under the internal stories, those first three, that I have identified as being huge red flags, are identity and how a sales professional or a sales leader views their identity and how do they show up. And are they congruent with their role? Because quite often, there is this belief system that I don't want to be perceived as a salesperson. So if you're going to go into, a conversation with a buyer and you have that as a belief, it's going to play with your energy levels.
By the way, I'll just jump in. We hear this all the time. One of the core missions of our entire business is to align the concept or the verb of selling with exactly what you just talked about, which is selling is helping the buyer achieve a better outcome. Selling is management consulting. The stereotype is 50 years old of selling is peddling or cajoling, but that's been wrong for 25 years. Like, it's 50 years old, but it's been completely wrong for anybody who's sold anything material in the last 25 years. But
yeah, I do think yes, I understand the concept of serving the buyer and helping the buyer. Absolutely, that is our role.
It's actually educating the buyer. It's actually bringing the perspective of how they can run a better business with your solution, or how they can run a better business with insight and knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with that. There is also another component to this, and in my thinking, and that is it's all good and well, and we are there to serve and to help and all the rest of it, but we're also there to help ourselves. And so this has got to be, to serve the buyer and to serve our company. It's got to be a win-win, because if you go in purely with some salespeople, purely with this whole servant leadership approach, or I'm there to serve, that may actually tap into money beliefs. And that may actually impact the ability for a salesperson to not hold margin. If we're there to help them and we're being told by the buyer that you're too expensive, it may be that salesperson defaults to discounting. Just little nuances like that, and
I agree. I do think they're different things. So we're no different than a management consultant is in to help a client.
I agree.
Helping a client doesn't mean making sure we do it at a loss or affecting margin and discount. But the reality of it is, if I'm taking the right approach as a salesperson to focus on helping them,
totally.
Things like pricing and discounts don't matter.
Yes, and exactly. And then I also believe that, there's another kind of thought process I have, which I've always believed in, and that is we're playing the long game. Yes, there's a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And we mustn't lose that sense of urgency. But in the big scheme of things, we are playing the long game. If we are to truly be that respected industry resource. So yes, I'm with you there. So identity is definitely part of it. Authority is a second story mode that we delve into. And money is the third. So they are the three key areas that I see that sales professionals probably sabotage themselves the most, as far as those internal stories they're telling themselves about the buyer or the deal.
Thank you, Bernadette. So just while we're on that, before we go to the stories that we tell the buyers and the stories we elicit from the buyers, I love that part. If somebody's listening to this today, what might be a tip or two that they can start to think about in addition to reading the book that might help in those areas? Because you said You're seeing some salespeople sabotage themselves.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you're seeing, or some of the things that our listeners today could maybe focus on in this category?
Yeah, and I would actually, if I was with a salesperson now and they were, we were having this conversation, I would go into coach mode. I would actually ask them to consider a couple of things. I wouldn't necessarily tell them to do anything, because that your listeners at the moment, I would rather them contemplate a couple of thoughts.
Please.
I would rather them think. And the question would be, how are you showing up in front of your buyer? Like, let's get honest. What part of you is needs to be expanded? Like, there would be a part of you that has a belief about your role as a salesperson. Does that need to be expanded? Is there a part of you that resists prospecting? Is there a part of you that pushes back on holding margin? What is that part, and how can that part maybe be reduced? And so, there's an exercise in the book that, I'll get people to go through, but it really is looking at the different parts of us. And yes, we are almost schizophrenics. We're, made up of multiple parts.
I mean, it's not just me.
No. I used to think it was just me, by the way. So I would get them to kind of answer themselves or think about that. Secondly, I would ask them to think about their beliefs around people in authority.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, if you were driving along the highway and you looked out your rear vision mirror and you heard this lights flashing, what would you do?
Pull over because it's the police.
What would you do because it's the police? What would you do?
I'd pull over if they're trying. I'm assuming they're coming after me. There
you go. And so it's like, what have I done wrong? Pumping the brakes, you're looking at check seatbelt, and they just speed right past you.
Yes.
So what is it about the fact that because they were police? So we've grown up in an environment where we have to respect authority, whether it's the teacher, the priest, the police, and then you grow up and there's CEO written on a door. And it doesn't matter if that person is younger than you or not. Nearly 25% of people have a fear of authority. And you roll that out across the sales profession, and we start to kind of marry together the identity that some salespeople have, that may not help them or serve them as much. Marry that with a fear of authority, and then add into that money beliefs. I think $100 is a lot of money, but gosh, I'm selling something for $100,000. How is that going to impact my ability to have those financial conversations?
Great.
So they are the three story modes that I address insofar as the internal stories are the stories that salespeople tell themselves, and not just salespeople, business owners, sales leaders.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely right. Love them. Great. So let's move on to the stories we tell buyers. And what are the story modes we need to think of there?
So this, I think, is where, there's a couple of different avenues to go here. One is, we mentioned earlier, traditional storytelling, where you have your origin story or your signature story, your connection story, whatever it may be. And it follows the hero's journey, and there's method in its madness. A case study is different than a success story. A case study is all about you, couched around a buyer. A success story is all about the buyer. So we know that is an important part of selling. And I mean, that's something that we also address. But what I've done is I've taken it a step further, and I've thought, okay, I want this book to really shift and disrupt the way a salesperson thinks about telling stories. And when we think that 83% of our processing is done visually and 11% of our process is done auditorily, if that's a word. Why don't we try to capture a story visually? And, you know, I did a little, this is thought leadership coming into it now, and the ability for you to be sitting over a coffee with a prospect and listening and eliciting their stories and being able to capture and know how to, so this is very much a playbook as well, is know how to capture their story. And grab your pen, grab your napkin. You hear that cliche all the time, you know, grab a napkin and just kind of do a deal on a serviette.
We did a deal back of the napkin.
Exactly. And so how can you do that and be able to capture and collaborate on what you're hearing? Because when you draw something, you're actually drawing someone in. And when we think about the fact that as children, our first attempt at art was shapes, triangles, squares, circles. So why would we not lean into that part of us as well, and really be able to collaborate? So what I've done there, and you know, Charlie Munger, you know, Warren Buffett's,
Berkshire.
He says that, you know, you've got to be able to capture your ideas on a framework of mental models. Because what it does, a mental model, and we're talking here about a ladder, a 2x2 matrix, or a Venn diagram. A mental model helps decision making. It simplifies the complex. And it paints a picture. And we know that, you know, what is the saying? A picture paints 1,000 words.
Yes.
And so what I've done in the book, the 3 modes there, are based around progression, tension, and integration. And let me just break those down. Progression, every one of us wants to progress. We want growth, whether it's personal growth, whether it's professional, business growth, whatever it may be. So we've all seen Maslow's hierarchy.
Yes.
You know, we've all seen Dr. Claire Graves' spiral dynamics. So they are examples of progression models. Now, when you're able, and you would pre-bake these, so you would do your research and you would build these out beforehand because you know your target market. Mm-hmm. And if you're wrong, it doesn't matter because it's an opportunity for discussion. And so you don't have to do all 3 of these. You may choose to create a ladder or an aspirational hierarchical model and discuss the growth path for your buyer or for their business. Secondly, a ladder like Maslow's hierarchy will always give us why change is important. And so that's the why. The second one, which is all around tension, is how do we build intensity into the sales conversation? Because we want our buyers to be sitting on the edge of their seat. We want them to be thinking, okay, what do I need to do? And if we look at any 2x2 matrix, you know, we look at the Eisenhower matrix, time management. We look at Robert Kiyosaki's. Where
are you? Where do you want to go?
Exactly. And so the labels, the quadrants, have tension. And we want to be able to build intensity into our sales conversations by telling and collaborating a story. And a 2x2 is always a what. What do I need to do? And so when you get to that final top right-hand quadrant, it's like, yeah, that's what I want. And in my conversion matrix in the book, it's like, yeah, I want to accelerate my team's conversions. I want to build the conversions of my sales pipeline. So how do I do that, Bernadette? And that naturally leads to a how. And a Venn diagram is always around how. And so a Venn diagram is all about how do we integrate and how do we articulate outcomes. And so what I've shared with you early on, the story selling circles, is my Venn diagram. So I will sit with somebody, build it out with them, because I've elicited their stories along the way.
Yes.
And it's just a no-brainer. They then know, oh my gosh, you get me. So they are the three external stories that we tell our buyer using mental models.
Just love it. And by the way, if you've got a well-identified ideal client profile,
yes,
and you focus as a business, what these are. And every time you have this conversation, you're going to get better at it. And you have more feedback and input.
Yep.
Because you're learning every time you go through this. And by the way, here's something to double underline, team. Even if we're slightly wrong with this point of view, it doesn't matter. It's this opportunity for discussion and engagement.
Absolutely. And one of the tenets of true coaching is there is no right or wrong.
Right.
And so when you can go to market with that whole belief system that it doesn't matter what I put down, it doesn't matter what I suggest, there's no right or wrong. It's simply my perception. And the buyer will always have their own perception. And when you can collaborate and you can clarify and you can be on the same side of the table and be really comfortable and congruent and saying, hey, I might have got this wrong. Let's talk about it. You're going to get gold out of that, because they are going to know that whole like, trust, and know, like, and trust component is just off the charts.
Yeah. The other, I think it aligns with so much just basic common sense. And I think that's where a lot of this heads, Bernadette. I think we're in for a common sense revolution in
I agree.
Professional sales. It's coming.
Totally agree.
It just leads to, I'm not pitching anything except your wisdom. We have knowledge and insight where we're going to teach them something different, perhaps they haven't seen before, or prompt that discussion. And this is where you're elevating that trust and credibility and all those kinds of good things. And all of the walls drop when you're in this kind of conversation. It's a different level.
Yeah, it totally is.
Yeah.
And when you get it and you can play with it and you can try it on and you'll get blisters like a new pair of shoes and you get blisters, and it's like, that's okay. They will eventually become such a comfortable conversation. And that's probably the another vehicle to get there is that third I guess root cause, and that is not being able to elicit their stories the correct way. And so leaning into the coach approach is how you can elicit those essential stories. Because, when you have this whole coach approach, they do all the talking because you know what you're doing, the questions that you're asking, and you know why you're asking them. It allows you, so if we kind of flip into those three story modes, it's about expansion, it's about perspective, and it's about decision. And so we want to be able to build flexibility into our conversations, which is how do we expand? What's the expansion? How do we elicit the stories through, showing that flexibility? Because if you, as a sales professional and a sales leader, we have to now, even more so than ever, we have to communicate with so many different levels within an organization.
Yeah. And
the chokehold that I'm seeing with businesses out there is that, we still talk about don't talk, brochure talk, but you build in this fear of authority, you build in, all of this other stuff, and you're finding salespeople will just take the path of least resistance, which is going to the level that they're comfortable talking to. And so what are those conversations we have that enable us to move between C-level contextual conversations, operational conceptual conversations, and user-based content conversations? And so it's really bringing in this flexibility, and the person who is able to have the conversation with every level will own the business. And so I teach how to do that.
So a couple of it, wonderful. First of all, just great. The way you've simplified this approach, and it's very much a clean set of eyes on some things that have been age-old prophecies, as you point out in the book. I think you quote Plato about communication. I could have that wrong, but I thought I heard that. Aristotle, one of those guys. But when you start to the last point you just referenced, where you're dealing with different people in the organization, and they have dramatically different personal and professional needs and wants.
Correct.
That goes back to the wonderful days when I had hair in 1991 with strategic selling, frankly. That's where those, I think it's actually earlier. I think it was even 15 years before me. It was like the 80s. But that's where they came up with the buyers. And that has not changed in 40 or 50 years. The fact that we have to understand the different folks involved. There's a lot of talk today, Bernadette, about, the buying groups increased and so on and so forth. No, it hasn't for anything material.
I agree.
If you were selling a widget for $50 or $5,000, maybe there was one person. But if you were doing an enterprise software deal or a large outsourcing deal, there were 15 people involved in that. So it was always multiple buyers for anything material, and they always had difficulty coming to consensus.
Yeah.
And you were trying to provide thought leadership and guidance. The main difference would be they did have to take some of to from you at face value because they didn't have access to the global encyclopedia of everything that's happened up until 2021 through ChatGPT.
Yes, exactly. But, even out there at the moment, there's, within enterprise sales organizations, there are still territories that don't necessarily sell to enterprise. So that may be the component of that particular global company, a big company, but the sales team may still be selling to SMB.
Yes.
And so they still do have just that one point of contact. And so it could be that salesperson is dealing with the CEO of an SMB, but they're still talking at the user level. So it can be, okay, how can I take my salesperson who only has like legal firms or small family manufacturing company, how can I take that particular salesperson and up their ability to be able to have a C-level conversation with that one particular buyer? So it goes across both enterprise sales, where you do have multiple stakeholders, and the SMB space as well.
Completely agree. You're absolutely right. And just a couple of things I'd like to just talk about with you, because I'm trying to connect some dots, and this would be opinion, not fact. But one of the opinions, because I love your research-based approach to this, and I think, it certainly aligns with our approach in the funnel. One of the things we are noticing is, the increase in mental health issues with professional salespeople.
Yeah.
And generally, they're not happy. And so one of the things you've just talked about here is many professional salespeople have this comfort level dealing at certain very tactical levels like users. For you or I, selling to a user is actually at times kind of unpleasant, because they're just sitting there used to a demo. They can't say yes. They can only say no. They're not strategic. They're trying to just get through every day and maybe worry about what went wrong yesterday. And so if salespeople want to default to only doing that, then they default to pitching, because they're not getting strategic conversations from typical users. This whole thing is no fun.
I agree. And I think, this, it comes back also to, my mind's going in a couple of different directions here, because I'm thinking, how do they elevate their connection? And how do they actually make contact today? Because you think about email is just completely spam. Voicemail, it's an unknown number. LinkedIn is completely spammy.
Spam.
How do you, I mean, and there's apps and there's stuff that you can short circuit, and how do you actually make contact? And, that is the frustrating part, I think, for all of us. And you get a lot of gurus out there talking about, prospecting, but they're not doing it anyway. And so how do we make contact with the right person to start with? And that's a question, and it comes back to, do we go back to the old days where it was direct mail? Is networking making a comeback? There's all of these different avenues, but that salesperson who's stuck with the user, their hands are tied for a couple of reasons. Their leadership team won't bring people in to elevate the learning.
Right.
And because in some instances, that leader doesn't want to be showing up for not knowing what to do.
Exactly right.
So it's a catch-22. And I'm with you there. And the salespeople, they need support internally, and it's got to come from all levels. It's got to be a conversation that has to be had.
Well, we have this conversation on this podcast. This is great, by the way. You and I are going to talk for 2 hours offline from this podcast. Really great. So you asked, how do you do that today? So our belief is the automated, the spam, garbage, just wasting everybody's time.
I agree. Yeah.
There was a time, you and I will remember, where you and I got 30 voicemails a day. We actually had days and times where our voicemail could fill up even if we were working. Today, I get 2 or 3 voicemails a day. If you want to reach me, first of all, it's got to be a multi-channel approach, but call me. Secondly, do 10 minutes of research on me, my business, my industry. I always say, I'm listed, Bernadette, as the CEO of In the Funnel. Whether that's the right or wrong thing, I am. So we do get hit 30 times a week. At least 5 times a week, we get hit by a sales training company that says, hey, Mark, do you want to improve the way your sales team is selling?
Yeah.
We are a sales training company.
Yeah.
So if anybody had ever just gone to our website, they'd go to a video that tells them how to do demand generation. We talk about this, and all they'd have to do in a voicemail to me is say, hey, Mark, let me see if your in the funnel practices work. I noticed today that you've got 3 levels of social media. We help with the 4th. This is an opportunity. By the way, I really love the video you put on YouTube talking about A, B, and C. I am morally, ethically compelled to respond to that voicemail.
Yep. I agree.
It's so painfully easy.
Yeah, I agree.
But what's happening in professional sales today is what we want to do is say, hey, I made 100 calls today and I didn't get any live conversations. So why don't I try and, email blast 300 people tomorrow and 800? We just keep doing more of what's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just stop.
And that's what I'm saying. It's like somebody's leading that practice.
They are, because and the other point you really bring on, and I have a lot of empathy for them. You talked about sales leaders aren't feeling comfortable to bring in somebody from the outside world to coach their team. But again, folks who listen to our podcast have heard me rant on this many a time. The best performers in the world have multiple coaches. So the top performers of the world, most successful entrepreneurs in the world are part of either Strategic Coach or Gazelles or EOS. The best athletes in the world have 9 coaches.
Yeah, I agree. And, it comes back to ego. It does. And it comes back to identity. Yeah. And, everything swings back to the internal stories. It's a complete circle. And Yeah, yeah. And so when you can understand, so I'm going off on a different tangent here.
Me too.
It's like so I'm kind of going back to that final circle. I just talked about building, showing flexibility when we were talking about the CEO.
Yeah.
The next story mode, which kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about then, is based on perspective. And that is all about how do we identify criteria. And so from our buyer, and we're talking about that, we know the cliche, we all buy on emotion and we back it up with logic.
Yes.
We actually need a bit of logic before it goes into the emotional, and then it swings back to logic again. And so being able to identify, and this is using the coach approach, being able to go from the shallow. So if you do picture the iceberg, most salespeople and sales leaders are playing in the shallows. They're understanding outcomes. Everybody understands outcomes and what a buyer or a sales team member needs, but what is it that they don't want? And that's another question to ask. And then as you go deeper under the iceberg, being able to elicit those states that are really the values of that particular buyer or their business or your sales team. What is important to that salesperson? What is really important to that buyer? At a personal level, and then understanding what comes next underneath it, further under the iceberg is, okay, so if growth is important to your buyer, or if profitability is important to your buyer, or if support is important to your team member, your salesperson, what must have to happen in their eyes to achieve that? Because, we all make assumptions and we just think, oh, someone says they want support. So, okay, every Monday morning, come in and have a meeting with me. And I'll go, but that's not what they mean.
Yeah.
And so, the buyer wants profitability. Oh, great. Okay, well, we'll do X, Y, and Z. But that's not what they mean. So we have to identify that criteria further. And then the final story mode is decision, and that is land the business. Now we think about decision, it's all about who makes the decision, who else apart from yourself, when's the decision going to be made, what's the process for the decision. That's all external. We need to tap into the decision drivers of our buyer. And so that is at a deeper level as well. And so once you identify what those drivers are, then your conversation shifts again. And the same applies for the sales leader with their team.
Yeah. Again, so important. Frankly, if you've been doing this a while, it's so obvious, but it's not being done. And I think there's multiple reasons for it, but any sales leader listening to this call, in the next time you're having a collaborative discussion with one of your teammates on a deal status and an update, deal strategy, when you say, okay, tell me what's important to this person, and your salesperson's response says, well, obviously they want to do this, this, and this. It's not obvious unless the buyer told me it.
Correct.
It's not my assumption. It's what did they specifically say and why?
Yeah, and that's the stories we've got to elicit, and they are the stories that are so often missed. So it's like having a three-legged stool here, and the stool's only got two legs, or the stool's only got one, but it's the third leg is what's really missing as well, and that's going to make a rock solid deal.
Well, one of the things, Bernadette, we've found, and maybe you can confirm from your perspective, we actually see, many salespeople are afraid to ask that question about what might get in the way of moving forward, or what are you worried about? Because they think that if I ask the question, I'm going to give the buyer a reason not to move forward. Mm-hmm. When the reality of it is, in today's day and age, that buyer's got 15 reasons for not moving forward that is literally keeping them awake at night. So why not have a conversation about them?
Yeah, and this, you mentioned Jeb Blunt earlier. I spoke at Outbound, his conference last year, and I put this up on the main stage screen and used it as an example, is that when a buyer does give us old term an objection, I really don't like that word. I think they're actually sharing some concerns with us.
Yes.
What we do instinctively is we justify. We go into justification mode and we try to sell. And what we need to do is we need to elicit the story behind that concern.
Nice.
And it's like, so, okay, we're a little bit too expensive, or, our delivery's not on point. What has happened to make you think that way?
Yes.
And that's giving us data, and it's giving us the story behind the story. Now we can acknowledge that, and we can respond with a story of another client who had a similar thought process. And it just expands the conversation. It's collaborative, and then we can move on.
You're absolutely right. However we term it, we need to understand it, and that's part of the collaboration.
Yeah.
And in fact, again, for those of us who used to do material deals, very significant deals, one of the things that would happen from a client side would be both parties would be working from one business case. So at that level of deal, multi-$100 million deal, there's no our perspective and your perspective. There's our collective perspective. Let's agree on what we all think is going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's what you're going to use to take up the channel and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once we're aligned and we agree, then we negotiate how do we split the value. And they're not afraid to do what's right for their business. And then I have to be comfortable doing what's right for my business.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. But we're at least aligned on what we believe the facts are. And so for these things, these are difficult to come to the end game, but then we're just having this real conversation about the important points. We're not coming from two different places. That way we know what happens if we get to an impasse. And we have this real decision to make. People aren't going quiet on you. They don't stop returning calls. They don't give you a pretend reason or the political reason they didn't move forward. They actually just tell the truth.
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to jeopardize. We're doing this over here, Mark. And I'm just not prepared to jeopardize that with this new initiative. And it's going to take some of the same IT resources and some of the same business resources. I don't think I've got the capacity to do it.
And that comes back to the risk factor has nothing to do with before signing the order. It's what happens after the order's signed.
That's right.
That's where the risk factor. So in the book, I talk about the cost of inaction, the cost of the problem, the cost of all these different costs, because that has to come into the conversation as well. And that's way back in the beginning as part of your collaborative understanding. And we talk discovery, but it is that I guess professional conversation that is business. It's a business conversation.
Yes, it is. And all of these conversations are far more fun than pitching product at a user and hoping that user somehow can magically sell your product because you couldn't.
Yeah.
So now you're hoping they can take it up. Bernadette, I have to be very cautious of your time. I can't believe the amount of time we've spent talking, how fast this has gone for me. Oh my gosh,
that's an hour.
What an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. I personally have just received enormous value from this conversation. I am darn sure that the people listening to this podcast have as well. First of all, thank you so much for joining. My pleasure. It's been fun. If people want to learn more about you, which they inevitably will, what's the best way to do so? LinkedIn, please join me on LinkedIn and mention that, you heard me on the podcast. That would be awesome for Mark as well. And my book, Shift and Disrupt, here it is here.
It's on
Good.
Amazon now. If you are a sales leader and you have a team, go to shiftanddisrupt.com because there are bonuses there for sales leaders. And yeah, I'm also running a webinar. So if you're on LinkedIn with me, you'll see the webinar coming up where I'll be running through this. So it's there's a few channels.
Please make sure we're on the list of invitees for that webinar. And we're going to share that with our network as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
They're going to get lots of value from that. And folks, when you're thinking about your next keynotes, you're probably planning for next year in the not too distant future. Please check out Bernadette's website, which will be in our show links, because she's done keynotes for some of the top organizations in the world, and that some of the top thought leaders in sales have actually engaged Bernadette to come and do those keynotes. Thank you so much for today, Bernadette.
My pleasure. It's been awesome.
Sure has. Team, thank you, team, for joining today. As always, we run the podcast to try and elevate the performance and professionalism of B2B sales. And in doing so, we want to improve the lives of professional salespeople. And we hope that you've enjoyed today's podcast. And if you do, by the way, please like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast, because that's really helpful to us. Thank you for that. If there's ways that we can improve this podcast, I'd love to hear your ideas. My email is markcox@inthefunnel.com. That's my personal email that I check. And if you give us some constructive criticism, I am personally going to respond to that email. And we love constructive criticism. The more direct, the better. It's just faster. We love it. Thank you for doing that. We'll see everybody next time on the Selling Well podcast.